Let me first start off by saying I'm a little surprised how many people are here at 4:30, so I do appreciate it. Before we talk about the state of the games industry, just a quick show of hands. How many folks work in mobile specifically? So about half the room. How many people PC specifically? And then what about console? Okay, nice. That's great. Again, ultimately, the goal today is I have the next hour with you guys. I want to talk through how we are seeing the game space. Again, I'm not sure if folks were in the audience for Matt's keynote today in the morning, but again, I think the big thing that he kept mentioning was how well the games industry is doing. And today, I have the fun job of actually showing the numbers behind games. But for folks who don't know who I am, my name is Chirag Ambwani. I lead the games and entertainment space for a company called Sensor Tower. And for folks who don't know what we do, we are the leading data provider for the mobile, PC, and console ecosystem. And again, the plan today is for the next 40 minutes or so, give you guys a sense of what we're seeing in the market for PC, console, and mobile. And hopefully, these are things you guys can take into 26. And ultimately, hopefully, you guys find this time valuable. So specifically, I want to just spend a little bit of time just talking about the game space in general. First and foremost, should not surprise anybody. People have said it for a while. Games is doing extremely well. Just to put into perspective, from now to March 1st specifically, across mobile, console, and PC, it has driven over 44 billion in downloads or units. Again, it's just a testament. Games is actually doing very well. Now, when we look at this from the revenue and the consumer side, I think things get even more interesting. The App Store, I know a lot of people have been talking about Apple and Google. The dominance continues. Till November 1st, it's already 70 billion has went through the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store for gaming. Mobile continues to be the one that drives the majority of the gaming revenues. However, on the PC console side, I think things are actually going really well. And I want to specifically highlight Steam. Steam's already up to a little over 9 billion. And just for context, November and December are the biggest gaming months of the year. So we are expecting Steam to have another record year for this year. However, now when we take a step back and actually look at it across these three platforms, I think things get really interesting. When we look at this from the download side, downloads have been challenged for specifically mobile for a couple of years. There's a couple big themes that have been playing mobile specifically. The big one being ATT, advertising has become harder and harder on mobile. However, even with that said, the download side is still doing really well. Google or Apple, roughly down about 6% this year. But again, as I mentioned, November and December are the biggest gaming months, but over 6.5 billion downloads have went through Apple. So Apple's still doing extremely well. When we look at this for the Google Play side, Google Play similarly a little over 6% decline as well. But again, 36 billion in downloads across the Google Play Store. But the fun one that I want to talk about today is, again, Steam. Steam's doing extremely well. I think, of course, you're starting to see more and more stores try to creep into the Steam ecosystem. Ultimately, the numbers don't lie. Steam is becoming even more dominant on the PC side specifically. Had about a 1% growth, but again, November and December, we're expecting Steam to have a record year again for not just downloads, but on the revenue side. But again, I think a fun fact I did want to highlight is when you sort of add the mobile gaming side against Steam, for example, you could see mobile gaming is over 40 billion in downloads versus Steam at about 500 million. The mobile side is multiple times bigger than the PC and the console space. But again, the revenue sides are really healthy. Apple is by far where majority of the revenue comes from, 44 billion versus 25 for Google, and of course, 9 billion for Steam. Now, when we look at this from the audience standpoint, I think this is where things get also really interesting. It should not surprise anybody. When we specifically look at the PC console landscape, it tends to be millennial males that are the biggest consumers of console and PC. Specifically for console, about 75% of folks who are playing console games are millennials, but almost 80% of them are male. PC, a little bit better, about 30%. Of the audience is women, 70% still male. But this is where I think part of the reason why I think mobile is so much bigger and more dominant, they've done a really good job with getting the female audience. When we really look at this from the casual side, so specifically mobile, hyper-casual, and casual, you can see more than 50% of the audience is women. And again, I think this is a testament that mobile has built content that has gravitated towards both sides of the audience. Core gamers on mobile, closer to the PC landscape, about 30% are women. But again, it's just a sign that ultimately, if you can get both audiences, that's where the real money, of course, is. Now, let's look at the amount of games that are going on the platforms themselves. And again, you can kind of see the difference between the mobile side and the non-mobile side. Specifically, you'll see on the mobile side, there was quite a steep drop-off from 23 onwards. It peaked at around 58,000 new games were coming on the Apple and Google Play Store every year. It's now down to about 30 to 35,000. Part of the reason being the last couple of years, I know there was a big wave of layoffs, specifically in 23. Part of the reason being more and more mobile gaming developers were focused on their live titles in the market. So you're starting to see more and more people being focused on trying to grow their existing portfolio. But again, it's a very different story on Steam. You can see Steam is already up to 17,000 new games have launched this year on the Steam ecosystem. And again, when you kind of look at this back from 2020 in the pandemic, it's already doubled. So there are 2x more games on Steam every year versus they were on 2010, just showing that the competition for time and attention in games is becoming even bigger and bigger. The one thing I did want to highlight, and I know ads is always a very touchy subject for the game space, but again, as I was mentioning, and when we have these conversations with our clients, one thing to note is ultimately gaming is competing with other game developers, but you're essentially competing with time with all types of apps and games and media. But the big thing that I think has really scaled is the advertising. We've seen almost $9 billion in advertisement going to the top 14 markets. Again, audience and trying to get that audience is becoming harder and harder. And the companies that are doing advertising and getting to their audience are ultimately reaping the rewards. And when you look at this on the impression side, over 1.7 million impressions have went for the games category. Again, an all-time high. Now, when we specifically look at where is the dollars of advertising going, this is where I think things get really interesting. Ultimately, mobile gaming companies tend to be focused on mobile ad networks. These are the Unities, the AppLovins, and this goes back to mobile is very performance-oriented, whereas PC console tends to be more brand-oriented. And this also shows up in the ads data, right, where you could see Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, these social networks tend to be where the PC console devs are spending their money. But majority of that for mobile is going to the likes of YouTube and the traditional sort of ad networks. And now, to take a little bit of deep dive into the mobile space specifically, ultimately, I think I mentioned mobile is down in terms of downloads, but this is where I think things get really interesting. You could see from a download standpoint, specifically the peak was back in 2021. Of course, for folks who were here in 21, and I'm assuming everyone was, this is, of course, pandemic years. You could see right in 23, there's starting to be a dip in the download side. And this goes back to developers focusing on the live titles that they have in the market. And you can now see this revenue per download. Just to give perspective, 23, we were averaging about $1.50 per download. It's now already over $1.70, just showing that the developers who focused on their live titles and creating better content for their live have ultimately reaped the rewards of the new revenue growth. However, this is the fun view I love talking about. I think there's a sentiment that, oh my God, gaming peaked. In reality, this is the first year in 5 years that the consumer demand for gaming is now back to pandemic levels. So peak of Q1 21, the game's revenue for mobile touched 21.2 billion. It's now up back to 21.2 billion. And as I mentioned, November and December are the biggest game space. So this might be the first year in 5 years that mobile gaming has actually surpassed the pandemic highs. Another fun thing I did want to talk about is, I think for devs and pubs in the audience, we always tend to talk about the East versus the West. I wanted to split this out by countries because I think this really shines why I think there's so much more growth coming from mobile nowadays. Part of the reason being, I think folks are starting to look at the West, not just the US. They're starting to focus on markets like the European markets. But I want to first touch on US. US, by far the #2 market in terms of downloads and revenue, only surpassed by China, which we'll talk about. But it's down about 5% in downloads, but doing really well. It's up 5% in revenue from a pretty big base. When you sort of look at China, it's on the completely opposite end. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost, there's been a lot of big titles, and we'll talk through those titles that have launched in China. But one of them is Delta Force, which I'll talk about today. But you're starting to see more and more of the Chinese developers focusing on their local markets, and they're starting to really see huge growth. And now when we look at this on the European markets, again, we usually do a Western view, but you could see the likes of France, Italy, and of course Spain seeing almost now double-digit growth in downloads and even double-digit growth in revenues. And again, when we have these conversations with developers, we're starting to see developers localizing and focusing on these regions as individual countries, which was not traditionally how they looked at the West. The one I did want to highlight, if there are any Japanese developers in the audience, this is another year while Japan is starting to kind of decline, especially on the RPG side. It's about 2% growth in downloads, but specifically on the revenue side, it's about 3% down. So Japanese, this is another year where the Japanese market, which is the third biggest for games, has had declining growth. Now, when we look at what genres and what types of games are doing well, this is the first time where mid-core is dominating on mobile. And we'll go into the specific genres and the publishers and developers that are really driving it. But the mobile gaming audience, quarter over quarter, has added over 200 million downloads in the mid-core section. Hyper-casual tends to be the one that's still declining, part of the reason being advertisements have become really hard. And monetization is a big focus now for developers. So you're starting to see hyper-casual still having declines. The fun one is casual. While it looks bleak, downloads are down over 100 million from last quarter to this quarter. Revenues are doing really well. It's already added 200 million in a quarter. And again, casual developers are doing extremely well, specifically in the West. And now let's go into the genres themselves. And as I mentioned, puzzle, it's another year where puzzle dominates the space. This is the likes of where Candy Crush, Royal Match, Royal Kingdom, the household names continue to be the ones that people are playing. It's also those audiences where a lot of the women players are. And again, it's just a sign that the women audience is really monetizing well on mobile. But strategy has not been on the top for a while, but this is the first year in a very long time that strategy is the #2 genre in terms of revenue. And there's some key games that I'll touch on too in the section. But one thing I did want to highlight and keep attention to this when we get to the PC console side, action not doing well on mobile. And this is another year where action titles are starting to see big declines in revenue. And now we actually go to what are the top 10 games for Q3. And again, this is a fun one for me to share because a lot of these games are brand new. These are not the household names that people think about when they think about the top 10, which I think is a great sign for developers that there's still a big opportunity if you have good titles on the market. The fun one I want to talk about is Kingshot. They added over 160 million in the quarter. Just to give you guys perspective, this game launched in Q2. It's already in the top 10 for driving the most growth in revenue. It's by a maker, Century Games out of China. They now have 2 of the top 10 games, and they were not a big developer a couple of years ago. The fun one that I like talking about is Clash Royale. Clash Royale Legacy, been on the market for 13 years on the Apple and Google Play Store. This is the first time since December 2016 that they are now in the top 10. And again, this is another sign that developers are focusing on their existing titles, and you can kind of see they're reaping the rewards of it. On the puzzle side, again, I wanted to mention Gossip Harbor and Royal Kingdom. Again, Royal Kingdom is by Dream Games, who have Royal Match. This is their newest title in the puzzle category, doing really well. Gossip Harbor, again, a fun one. They have 5x their revenue in 3 years. A lot of this is going back to live ops. The one I did want to mention, it's the outlier of this top 10, is the shooter, which is Delta Force. For a lot of developers, we've been talking about cross-platform, the games that will really rise it's the one example of doing extremely well on both PC console and mobile. And now when we go into it, let's go spotlight into the shooter category. You know, shooter, transparently, since 21 has been declining. This was a big year for shooter. We had Fortnite come back on mobile. We had Delta Force. Of course, on the PC console side, we have Battlefield 6. There's been a lot of shooter and a lot of momentum for shooter this year. But again, I wanted to highlight Delta Force. It has a really healthy split between mobile and PC console, specifically dominating in the East, in China specifically. But again, some other ones that don't get talked about much, Valorant's doing really well. Valorant's on mobile now. Destiny also had a really good launch on mobile. So again, shooters are starting to see some growth again. Of course, we've been talking a lot about the big publishers in the market, but what about the smaller guys? I think this is a really healthy chart, which is you are starting to see developers who've made less than 100 million all time. This is for the last 13 years. What you've really started to see is there's 3 key categories that they're actually gaining more share. First one, puzzle. I mean, it's pretty much across the board. Puzzle is in demand. More and more mobile gaming players want puzzle games. You're starting to see the biggest guys get bigger, but even the smaller titles driving a lot of growth. A mixed one is casino. This is traditionally where, like, if you guys have played games like Coin Master or Monopoly Go, they're starting to give back some growth, but you could see the casino players starting to go into these new and up-and-coming games that new developers are launching. The big one I'll spend a lot of time on specifically is simulation. Again, it's a really healthy one across the board. There's a lot of demand for it. There's one game or platform specifically that I want to talk about, which is Roblox. Roblox is dominant, and it really shows up on the mobile side. But you know, we've been talking about downloads, we've been talking about revenues. Engagement is the big thing that I also want to talk about. Not only is consumer demand for games up, people are actually spending time playing games again. Same thing, the peak of gameplay was in Q2 of 21. So again, pandemic right before the majority of the world started to lift their pandemic closures. As of Q3 of this year, it's up to 12.8 million. The peak was 13.3 million. So by the time, hopefully, if all things go well, we could have a record year also from the engagement side for mobile gaming. The other thing I want to quickly talk about is when I have conversations with executives, a lot of them are asking me, where are the next billion players going to come from? The one thing that's really great to highlight is here are the next tier of markets outside of US and China that we always talk about that are starting to show some really healthy engagement. Big one I want to highlight is Vietnam. It doesn't get talked about a lot. There's a lot of new publishers and developers coming out of Vietnam. There's a lot of engagement coming out of Vietnam as well for gaming. Of course, Brazil, the big Latin America market, is doing really well as well for engagement. US had a great year as well, and I think part of the reason being, I think you're starting to see people maybe saturating the TikTok and the social media wave and are starting to play games again. And then India, you could see the India growth. So these tier 2 markets, pay attention to them. In the next couple of years, they will become a bigger and bigger focus for developers. But again, as I mentioned, you cannot talk about engagement without talking about Roblox. Just to put into perspective, as I mentioned, simulation games are really hot right now. If you look at Q2 versus Q3 of this year, engagement's up 22% for the category of simulation, but specifically Roblox is up 39%. Just if you're developing games on Roblox right now, you will know there's a lot of demand for it. Another really fun one is Grow a Garden, which went viral on Roblox. We saw over 1 billion page visits in Q3, just highlighting that if you're a developer, there's a really big ecosystem that's being built on Roblox, and I think it's a big opportunity for taking advantage. And then, yeah, I think it's one thing to talk about engagement. It's another thing to actually show it on a graph like this. If you sort of look at specifically Roblox on mobile, they've almost 6x'd in terms of the amount of monthly active users from the pandemic. Just again, a sign that Roblox is here to stay. It will become bigger and bigger part of any developer's footprint moving forward. Now let's talk about who actually dominates from a company standpoint in the mobile gaming space. I mean, this was a fun graph to make. I mean, it's Tencent and then everybody else. Of course, they kind of own everybody at this point, but with Supercell and Clash Royale back to the number one, Miniclip. I mean, Tencent's the only developer that has multiple billions in revenue and over 400 million in downloads this year. But let's talk about the 9 underneath them. Two big US ones. Take-Two, I know we're all waiting for GTA 6. I think it gets forgotten that they did Zynga's acquisition a couple years ago. Zynga's doing really well. They have some of the major titles in the market like Screwjam. So putting Take-Two as actually the number 2 developer on mobile. Microsoft, of course, ABK acquisition is now fully absorbed. So Candy Crush, COD, they're doing really well on mobile as well. But it's this tier after that I really want to talk about. Again, when I have these conversations with mobile game developers, especially smaller mobile gaming companies, the feeling is like, we can't become in the top 10. It's so hard. We don't have the funds. And while that is definitely true, I think what's exciting to show is a lot of these companies are brand new. If I had shown this graph a couple of years ago, Funfly, Scopely, NetEase, Century Games, these were not in the top 10. So I think there is a positive that you have this ability to break into the top 10. With that said, of course, these companies have monster war chests. But I did want to highlight Century Games. As I mentioned, they now have 2 of the top 10 titles. They were not even in the top 50 4 years ago. Funfly doesn't get talked about a lot. They have Last War Survival, grossed over 1 billion downloads, only a year and a half old. And then, of course, we know Scopely and Dream Games with the Monopoly Go and Royal Match launches that were the top 2 games of the last 3 years. But yeah, now when we look at this individually, I love showing this graph. Roblox is on the opposite end. Roblox is dominant. The amount of people that are on the Roblox, it's kind of unfair to put Roblox here because I would consider them a platform, not a game. But again, Roblox is doing really well. I wanted to show just the dominance of Roblox on mobile. But again, I think the fun view is you can kind of see a lot of these are familiar names. Candy Crush has been on the market for a decade. Clash Royale has been on the market for a decade. There's a lot of legacy titles. You could see the focus from developers on their existing titles. But again, there are some new ones here. Last War Survival, Monopoly Go, Royal Match, Coin Master, King Shot. These are all in the last 3 years. So again, it is a healthy sign that if you have good games on the market, there's definitely growth for it. The other really fun thing is just like, what are consumers saying about mobile titles? You can kind of see when you look at the negative sentiment, I mean, pretty much negative and positive, people are always pointing out the bugs, which I think is a good thing that developer or consumers are saying that they want these games improved. I think what's really interesting is you can see services. As I mentioned, a lot of people are focused on live ops. And I think there's a lot of demand from consumers on keep uplifting these titles. But the other really fun one I did want to highlight is monetization. It is the silent majority, but a lot of people are complaining that these games are becoming very, very heavily monetized. However, the revenues don't lie. These games are having monster year after year. The other thing I wanted to mention is live ops. Again, as I mentioned, developers are focused on their existing titles. And you see that in the data in the amount of live services that they're releasing in their titles. When you sort of look at the amount of new offers or tournaments, it's at all-time highs. Again, just highlighting that having a strategy around focusing on your titles and keep making them in a way where consumers keep coming back to them is ultimately the way you drive the growth that you're looking for. The last thing I did want to highlight is just the amount from the different types of live services. You could see pretty much off the bat, the top 10 titles are having everything within their title. Everything from their login services, hard currencies, leaderboards. Again, just having a diverse strategy on live services is the way you start getting into the top 10, top 100 on the charts. The last thing I wanted to highlight on the mobile side is IPs. I mean, we forget, but advertising is hard. Getting to your audience is becoming harder and harder on mobile. The companies that are tapping into existing audiences with IPs are really the ones that are winning. Of course, for context, Pokemon Go is still a top 20 title. Now, of course, owned by Scopely. Dokkan Battle is a top 5 title in Japan in terms of revenue. Monopoly Go is the #1 IP game on the market. This is just a long way of me saying there's a huge opportunity for leveraging IPs to be able to unlock audience because there is a demand for games for these IPs. And then again, we are also seeing that across the live services side. You're starting to see in Q3 of this year, Free Fire just had a really big collaboration with Naruto, and it's now the #1 ad on the market. Raid Shadow Legends and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, again, just a sign more collaborations are here to stay. Ability to tap in audiences with IPs is a big part of this ecosystem now. And again, just for quick wrap up from the mobile side, again, while downloads are down, revenues are doing really well. There's still a big opportunity for growth. As I mentioned, the big 3 categories, puzzle, shooter, strategy lead the way, and then simulation really driven by Roblox. And then again, I can't stress this enough. Roblox is just becoming more and more dominant, and you will start seeing Roblox having growth in these tier 2, tier 3 markets now. All right, let's talk about PC console. Again, it's a very fun space. It had a really big year, and this is a fun one that I wanted to quickly touch on, which is when we look at the top 3 ecosystems for PC console, Steam is by far the dominant. It's driven over 575 million units on the platform. Again, it's going to have a record year. PlayStation and Xbox, again, they don't get talked to. I mean, they of course get talked about, but they're having sneakily good years. Also, part of this is driven by specifically Xbox Game Pass and PlayStation Plus. I think you're starting to see more and more subscription services being played by consumers. But when you sort of look at who are the top games on these ecosystems across AAA, AA, and of course indie devs, I think there's some fun views here. When you sort of look at it on the free-to-play side, it's starting to become bigger on PC console, starting to take some of the learnings from mobile and apply it. I know NetEase has had some challenges with Marvel Rivals. It's doing extremely well. It's the #1 free-to-play title on Steam. A fun one is Skate. EA dropped Skate on PlayStation and Xbox. Doesn't get talked about a lot, but they're doing extremely well. And I don't have a graph for this, but there was a lot of demand for Skate titles on mobile, and we saw a lot of people downloading skating-related games also. So there is this like cross ecosystem of people who are looking for the same titles across PC console and mobile. AA indie side, we're going to talk a lot about it. What are the top games? It had a really good year. We saw Peak, of course. Lots of people have talked about it. Had a really good year for an indie title and AA title. Rematch, again, one of the big ones for Xbox Game Pass. But the AAA side is also really interesting. Monster Hunter Wilds was the #1 game that launched this year, had a record over 10 million on Steam specifically. And then FC, EA's dominance. People love their soccer, or I should say football. I'm in Europe. Football titles. And then again, I have to highlight this. Steam is having a record year. I don't know if there's anyone from Epic or others, but I mean, clearly have not dented into Steam at all. As I mentioned, it's already up to 9.3 billion till November 1st. Most likely it will surpass the 10.6 billion that it did last year, probably closer to about 11 billion this year. And now when we look at what are the genres that are doing well on PC console, again, it's completely opposite of what's doing well on mobile, right? And again, this goes back to the audience point. Action's doing very well, whereas action's not doing well on mobile. Over 400 million downloads coming from action. I mean, big titles, Peak, Repo, Hollow Knight. It was a big year for the action category. Shooters, again, it hasn't been in the top 10 on the mobile side forever, but on the PC console side, people love shooters. Of course, it is a core, but Delta Force and specifically, of course, Battlefield 6. I cannot mention shooter now without the launch that EA had for Battlefield 6, which is becoming very dominant. And then RPGs, Monster Hunter Wilds, and then, of course, probably the game of the year, Expedition 33. So again, it's been a really good year for the PC console devs. And again, now you get to put this on a graph and you could see sort of the sales that have happened. When we look at this on the indie side, it's been a while since there's been that many indie titles that have more than 5 million units sold. Of course, we've already touched on it. Schedule One, Peak, Repo, Hollow Knights, there are so many titles released by indie devs that have done really well. AA is always a tricky one, but again, started the year off with the Elden Ring Night Rain, but you could see Expedition 33 here, Rematch. Again, still a really healthy ecosystem. But I do want to quickly touch on AAA. It's been a while since I've said this, but EA was the #1 publisher on PC console this year. They had 4 titles in the top 10, Battlefield 6, the 2 FCs, and UFC 5. So EA's strategy of really allocating towards more their core franchises of sports and entertainment is really paying off. EA is having a really big year. And then, of course, we just had the Call of Duty launch. If I had to guess, Call of Duty should be in the top again, post this holiday timeframe. But to spotlight Battlefield specifically, I think there's some really interesting lessons here for devs and pubs. The big thing here is, while Battlefield 6 is having a really good launch, when you sort of look at where are the user base for Battlefield 6 coming, this is where I think things get really interesting. We're really seeing their focus specifically on the US, and we'll talk about their ad strategy specifically, paying off in North America. They've overperformed in North America when you sort of look at their core competitors and even themselves with Battlefield 2042. You could see 37% of their current audience for Battlefield 6 comes from the US market, whereas you could see traditionally it was about 17 to 18%. Where they're really struggling is Asia and Europe. The Asia story, I think part of the reason being is the launch of Delta Force. This was, of course, not around. Delta Force with their cross-platform and, of course, being a Eastern publisher has really cemented themselves as the key shooter in the Eastern market. But again, they're also having struggles in Europe. And again, I think this goes back part of it to having a localized strategy for these markets, whereas EA put a lot of focus specifically on the US market, which we can actually go into and see it through the ads data. But again, it's just a clear sign that you do need a regional to get the full maximum value. But one thing I did want to quickly highlight is when we look at, of course, COD that just launched versus Battlefield 6, this is where I think this is a fun view to talk through. Call of Duty seems to have, and always will continue to kind of dominate this, like, the shooter, the player for shooter who aren't the hardcore shooter player. Right? You could see 56% of the Call of Duty audience tends to be, they play less than 10 hours. And I think this is an area that I think Battlefield 6 has really caught up on, but still is an area that Call of Duty over-indexes. I think this is where I think it's been interesting, and I'm curious how this goes into the holiday timeframe. This 10 to 100 hour gameplay, this is the first time that Battlefield 6 has really dominated this key category of audience. So this is kind of going up the step ladder. And about 56% of their audience is in this sort of bracket. But again, the hardcore shooter against Call of Duty and Battlefield, COD's still winning. With the holidays, I'm curious how this will change. But again, I think when you sort of compare these in terms of the amount of user bases for these two titles, this is where things get really interesting, right? You could see the hype from Battlefield 6 right away. There's a ton of audience. They did a really good strategy with their release schedule. And you could see at pretty much post-November, Battlefield 6 has more audience now across versus Call of Duty. But of course, COD's now launched. So we'll see how big of a gap this is. But again, it's a great sign that optimizing your launch and doing it through a good strategy and a good gameplay really pays off. And then this is where the ads data go into. You can see this is specifically their US ad spend for specifically Battlefield 6. And you can see they really drove advertising for their pre-beta. And again, I think this really helped. Of course, this was also a couple of weeks before the Call of Duty launch. So they really had this strategy of launching earlier, but also really gearing at with a lot of ad spend. And again, you can kind of see the Battlefield launch and Black Ops 7 launch, where they still wanted to have their branding of Battlefield 6 in the market. But for a lot of the indie and AA titles or developers in the audience, again, it was a big year. There's a couple key learnings to take away. The big one being a lot of content creators got behind these titles. And again, this is a big opportunity where ultimately virality has a huge part of the games ecosystem. Peak, Repo were some of the top titles if you were on Twitch or YouTube being played by influencers. The other thing is a lot of these titles and a lot of the big Xbox and PlayStation subscriptions like Game Pass are doing really well, and companies that have leaned into that have really had a lot of growth. And then again, sequels. People love sequels, and both Hollow Knight and of course Hades had a great launch this year. The other thing is, again, having new, unique views. You know, people love chaotic co-ops. It really leaned into the influencer side. The themes that really drove, and then again, quality beats everything. If you have good quality titles on the market, there's still a massive audience for it. But again, let's actually take a step back and look at who are the top 10 on the PC console ecosystem. If you looked at last year versus this year, Marvel Rivals drove the most installs or units on the market. Skate, again, these are a lot of free-to-play titles that you're seeing. But again, the big one that people don't talk about, Delta Force, doing very well. Specifically, now Steam is the biggest ecosystem. Their biggest ecosystem is actually China. So you could see this really showing up in the numbers. But again, the legacy titles, Dota, CS2, still doing really well. So free-to-play is, of course, where a lot of the growth is coming from. And then, of course, it shows up when you look at just the amount of audience in the market. It's CS2 still, it's Fortnite, it's, of course, the legacy titles of COD and Grand Theft Auto. But again, I have to highlight, this is Roblox. Roblox is also creeping up on the PC side as well. So again, this is one of the rare opportunities for having the top platform on both mobile and non-mobile. And then last thing I want to end it off, and I think we have some time for questions, is what are the most anticipated games that are still in wish list? The big ones I wanted to highlight, you could see there's a lot of sequels about to come out. Subnautical 2, Arc 2, Slay Spire 2. So again, these are big ones to watch. As we saw last year, sequels did really well. And then again, you're starting to see a lot of the big titles like Resident Evil and IPs that people have gravitated towards. And in conclusion, again, I love saying this one, games is doing really well. I think there's still a ton of audience for it. There's still a lot of demand for it. Ultimately, it's across all the ecosystems, PC, console, and mobile. Again, I think the other one is shooter is sort of becoming the avenue for cross-platform. We had a lot of them this year. I think it's a good one to start paying attention to because you will start seeing more and more developers starting to have their titles and take the learnings that shooters have done this year. And then lastly, there's still a huge opportunity for small publishers on both the mobile and the non-mobile side, as we saw with the specifically the genres, but it's puzzle on the mobile side, and it's really these co-op focused gameplay that really lean in for the PC console side. Cool.